The image is almost too perfect to be true. A glossy advertisement in the July 1968 issue of Autocar, a respected British automotive magazine, promising buyers so much extra for your money with the Moskvich four-door saloon and estate. The car in question, the Moskvich 408, sold in Western Europe under the brand name Skaldia 408, represented something that should not have existed according to the prevailing narrative of the Cold War. Behind what Winston Churchill had famously termed the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union was supposed to be sealed off, isolated, economically quarantined from the capitalist West. Yet, here was tangible proof that Soviet goods were not only reaching Western markets, but being actively marketed to consumers in London, Paris, and beyond. The reality of Soviet trade during the Cold War was far more complex, pragmatic, and economically significant than the simplified story of ideological isolation suggests. The contradiction was everywhere if you knew where to look. Walk into a camera shop in New York or London during the 1960s and 1970s, and you might find yourself holding a Zenit camera, manufactured in the Soviet Union but sold under various Western brand names: Cosmorex, Kalimar, Spiraflex, Fokina. Soviet optical equipment had earned a reputation for decent quality at competitive prices, and Western distributors were happy to rebrand and resell it. The same pattern held for watches, with Poljot timepieces finding their way onto Western wrists, and for electronics, with micro-radio receivers becoming modest bestsellers. These consumer goods represented the visible, almost quaint face of Soviet exports, the products ordinary people in the West might actually encounter. But they were merely the surface layer of a much deeper and more consequential economic relationship that would shape the geopolitical landscape for decades. The phrase Iron Curtain entered the global vocabulary on March 5, 1946, when Winston Churchill delivered his Sinews of Peace speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. His words painted a picture of a continent divided, with an impenetrable barrier descending across Europe from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. The metaphor was powerful, evocative, and politically useful. It helped crystallize Western anxieties about Soviet expansion and provided a conceptual framework for understanding the emerging Cold War. But like many powerful metaphors, it obscured as much as it revealed. The Iron Curtain was never as impermeable as the image suggested, at least not when it came to trade. Economic necessity and mutual advantage created channels of commerce that persisted even during the tensest moments of superpower confrontation. In 1949, 3 years after Churchill's speech, the Soviet Union established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, known by its acronym COMCON. The organization was explicitly designed to counter Western economic institutions and to bind the socialist bloc together through coordinated economic planning and preferential trade arrangements. The founding members included Poland, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Albania, though Albania would withdraw in 1962. Later, the German Democratic Republic, Mongolia, Cuba, and Vietnam joined. For the Soviet Union, COMCON served multiple purposes simultaneously. It provided a guaranteed market for Soviet exports, particularly fuel and raw materials. It created a network of economic dependencies that reinforced political alignment. And it offered a framework through which the USSR could access manufactured goods, machinery, and consumer products that its own economy struggled to produce in sufficient quantity or quality. The numbers tell the story of how central COMCON became to Soviet economic life. By 1960, the Soviet Union received 58% of its imports from COMCON members and exported 56% of its goods to them. This was trade on a massive scale, involving everything from Soviet oil and gas sold at below-market prices to Eastern European machinery, agricultural products, and consumer goods flowing back to Soviet ports and rail terminals. The arrangement was not entirely one-sided, but it clearly favored the USSR in certain respects. Soviet energy exports propped up Eastern European economies while creating dependencies that reinforced Moscow's political influence. At the same time, the USSR relied on its Comecon partners to supply products it could not efficiently produce domestically, from Czech furniture to Hungarian agricultural equipment to Polish manufactured goods. Yet even as Comecon trade dominated Soviet economic relations, the leadership in Moscow never fully closed the door to commerce with the capitalist West. The shift became more pronounced after 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev, first secretary of the Communist Party, announced a policy of de-Stalinization and declared a new course toward peaceful coexistence with the capitalist world. This was not a sudden conversion to free market principles or an abandonment of communist ideology. It was a pragmatic recognition that the Soviet Union needed access to Western technology, capital goods, and expertise if it hoped to compete economically and militarily with the United States and its allies. Khrushchev's famous visit to the United States in 1959 symbolized this new approach. The Soviet leader toured factories, farms, and research facilities, absorbing information about American industrial methods, agricultural techniques, and consumer production. One particularly memorable stop was at the farm of Roswell Garst in Iowa, where Khrushchev examined American corn cultivation methods with evident interest. The image of the Soviet premier holding corn cobs and discussing crop yields with an American farmer captured something important about the era. Ideology had not entirely displaced practical curiosity and the desire to learn from rivals. When Leonid Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev in 1964, the policy of détente with industrially developed capitalist countries continued and even expanded. Throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, the Soviet Union pursued trade relationships with the United States, France, Spain, Italy, Japan, and West Germany, all while maintaining its primary economic ties with Comecon nations. The culmination of this diplomatic and economic opening came in 1975, with the signing of the Helsinki Final Act on Security and Cooperation in Europe, a multilateral agreement involving the USSR, the United States, Canada, and nearly every European nation. The agreement addressed security issues, economic cooperation, and human rights, and it represented the high water mark of Cold War détente. For a brief period, it seemed possible that economic interdependence might gradually soften ideological divisions and reduce the risk of military conflict. That optimism took a severe blow in 1979, when Soviet troops deployed to Afghanistan, triggering a new phase of tension with the United States and its allies. Economic sanctions followed, along with boycotts and restrictions on technology transfers. Yet even during this renewed period of hostility, trade between the Soviet Union and the West continued, though at reduced levels and under increased scrutiny. By 1986, about 67% of USSR foreign trade came from socialist countries, 22% from capitalist countries, and 11% from developing nations. Export revenues made up 20% of the Soviet state budget, a figure that underscores how dependent the Soviet economy had become on foreign trade, particularly the sale of natural resources to the West. The centerpiece of Soviet exports to the West during the 1970s and 1980s was energy, oil and natural gas extracted from the vast fields of Western Siberia and other regions. European economies during this period were struggling with the aftershocks of the 1973 oil crisis and subsequent energy price volatility. They needed reliable, affordable energy supplies, and the Soviet Union was willing and able to provide them. The share of gas supplies in overall Soviet export volume grew from just 1% in 1970 to 15% by 1986. A 15-fold increase in relative terms and an even more dramatic increase in absolute volume. In 1970, the USSR exported 3.3 billion cubic meters of natural gas. By 1986, that figure had soared to 79.2 billion cubic meters. The deal that made this energy boom possible was signed in 1970 between the Soviet Union and West Germany. The arrangement was elegantly simple and mutually beneficial. West Germany would supply the USSR with large-diameter pipes and the equipment needed to construct a massive gas pipeline from Western Siberia to Western Europe. In exchange, the Soviet Union would supply West Germany with natural gas transported through that very pipeline. The deal became known as gas for pipes, and it laid the foundation for a long-term energy partnership that would bind the Soviet Union and later Russia to European markets for decades. The arrangement was controversial from the start. The United States viewed it with deep suspicion, arguing that it would make Western Europe dangerously dependent on Soviet energy and provide Moscow with both economic leverage and hard currency that could be used to fund military expansion. American officials lobbied hard against the deal, but West German leaders, along with their counterparts in France, Italy, and Austria, proceeded anyway. They calculated that the economic benefits outweighed the geopolitical risks, and they were unwilling to let Cold War ideology stand in the way of securing affordable energy for their industries and populations. The pipeline projects that followed were engineering marvels and logistical nightmares. Constructing thousands of kilometers of pipeline across the harsh terrain and brutal climate of Siberia required enormous investments of labor, machinery, and materials. Soviet planners mobilized vast workforces, including military units, prison labor, and civilian construction brigades. Western equipment and expertise played a crucial role, particularly in providing the high-quality steel pipes and compressor stations needed to move gas over such long distances. The Orenburg Western Frontier Pipeline, later renamed Soyuz, became one of the most important arteries of this energy network, carrying Soviet gas westward to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and eventually to Western Europe. By the mid-1980s, fuel and electricity accounted for 47.3% of all Soviet exports, making energy by far the most important category. The Soviet state had become heavily dependent on energy revenues, a dependency that would have profound consequences when oil and gas prices collapsed in the late 1980s. Machinery, equipment, and vehicles formed the second major category of Soviet exports, accounting for about 15% of exports in 1986. This was the category that included the Moskvich cars advertised in British magazines, as well as tractors, trucks, buses, and military equipment. The Moskvich, produced by the MZMA factory, later renamed AZLK, gained a modest following in Western Europe after performing creditably in international car rallies during the late 1960s. French and British consumers, attracted by the low price and adequate performance, began purchasing Moskvichs in small but noticeable numbers. The cars were also assembled under license in Bulgaria, where they were sold under the brand name Rila, and in Belgium, where they carried the Skaldia badge. By 1986, the USSR exported about 306,000 cars, 38,000 trucks, 39,000 tractors, and 2,919 buses annually. These were respectable numbers, though they paled in comparison to the output of Western and Japanese automakers. Military exports were another significant component of Soviet machinery sales. Starting in 1971 and continuing until the collapse of the USSR, the Soviet Union exported tens of thousands of military vehicles, including tanks, fighter aircraft, helicopters, and other equipment. primarily to allied nations and client states in the developing world. These sales served both economic and strategic purposes, generating hard currency while also spreading Soviet military technology and influence. The USSR also exported power-generating equipment, including turbines, generators, and even nuclear reactors, along with the engineering expertise and project designs needed to build hydroelectric dams and thermal power plants. Soviet engineers and technicians worked on energy projects from Egypt to India, leaving behind infrastructure that in many cases remains in use today. Yet, for all the machinery and energy exports, the Soviet Union remained a net importer of many categories of goods, particularly those requiring advanced technology or specialized manufacturing capabilities. From 1940 to 1986, more than 30% of Soviet imports consisted of machinery, equipment, and vehicles purchased abroad. By 1986, this category had grown to 40.7% of total imports. The USSR imported electrical equipment, metallurgical machinery, metal-cutting machines, jackhammers, train cars, trucks, ships, and much more. Foreign trucks from manufacturers like Tatra, Skoda Liaz, Mitsubishi Fuso, and Komatsu Nissan were deployed at major Soviet construction projects, including the Volga-Don Canal and the Baikal-Amur mainline railway. From 1945 to 1991, approximately 500,000 foreign cars were imported into the Soviet Union, though these remained luxury items accessible primarily to the political elite and members of the highest social circles. In 1986, cars, motorcycles, and scooters accounted for only 0.5% of total imports, while trucks and road equipment made up 3.5%. The second largest category of Soviet imports was food and raw materials for processing, which accounted for 17.1% of imports in 1986. This represented one of the great paradoxes and failures of the Soviet system. The USSR possessed some of the most fertile agricultural land in the world, vast expanses of black earth stretching across Ukraine and southern Russia. Yet, by the 1960s, the country was experiencing chronic food shortages. Urbanization and the migration of population from rural villages to industrial cities had disrupted traditional agricultural patterns. Collectivization under Stalin had destroyed the class of independent farmers and created a system of state and collective farms that proved chronically inefficient. In the early 1960s, some regions implemented food rationing, and shortages of meat, milk, grain, and other staples became common. The Soviet Union's transformation from a grain exporter to a grain importer illustrates the scale of the agricultural crisis. After World War II, the USSR resumed grain exports to Europe, reaching 4.5 million tons per year by 1952. Soviet leaders, eager to expand production, launched a massive campaign to develop the virgin lands of Kazakhstan, plowing up millions of hectares of steppe grassland and planting wheat. But the difficult climate, characterized by low rainfall and temperature extremes, meant that yields were unpredictable and often disappointing. Meanwhile, domestic demand for grain continued to rise, driven not only by population growth, but also by the need to feed livestock as part of a government program to increase meat and milk production. Khrushchev, inspired by what he had seen during his 1959 visit to the United States, launched a campaign to plant corn across the Soviet Union, convinced that this high-yield crop would solve the country's agricultural problems. Enormous resources were devoted to the corn campaign, with state agricultural budgets redirected, and collective farms ordered to plant corn even in regions where the climate was unsuitable. The results were disappointing. Corn yields remained low in most areas, and the focus on corn came at the expense of other crops. By 1963, the Soviet Union was forced to begin importing feed grain from the United States and Canada. In 1972, the USSR imported 23 million tons of grain. By 1980, that figure had nearly doubled to 43 million tons. The Soviet Union had become one of the world's largest grain importers, dependent on its Cold War adversaries for a basic necessity. Beyond grain, the USSR regularly imported meat, berries, fruit, sugar, and tea. Import volumes grew steadily throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. In 1960, the Soviet Union imported 66,000 tons of meat and meat products. By 1980, that figure had increased to more than 900,000 tons. Fruit and berry imports rose from 335,000 tons in 1960 to 995,000 tons in 1980. These imports were paid for largely with revenues from energy exports, creating a circular dependency. The Soviet Union sold oil and gas to the West and used the hard currency earned to buy food from the West and other suppliers. When energy prices were high, this arrangement was sustainable. When prices fell, as they did dramatically in the mid-1980s, the entire system came under severe strain. Consumer goods formed another major category of imports, accounting for 13.4% of total imports in 1986. Following Stalin's death, Soviet leaders had promised to improve living standards and provide the population with more consumer goods. But Soviet industry struggled to produce sufficient quantities of clothing, footwear, furniture, and household items, and what was produced was often of poor quality. At the 1981 Congress of the Communist Party, officials acknowledged that production plans for consumer goods were failing year after year, with particular shortages in fabrics, knitwear, and leather footwear. At that time, Soviet citizens on average owned 2.1 items of knitwear and 3.2 pairs of shoes per capita, figures that highlighted the scarcity. The hard currency earned from energy exports was used to import leather footwear, knitwear, cotton and silk fabrics, medicines, and other consumer goods. As the Soviet government pursued a policy of moving citizens out of communal apartments and into separate family apartments during the 1960s and 1970s, demand for furniture surged. Soviet citizens dreamed of owning Czech and Romanian furniture, which was considered superior in design and quality to domestic products. When shipments arrived at local stores, buyers lined up in long queues, hoping to purchase a wardrobe, a sofa, or a dining table. Despite the growth in consumer goods imports, the final decade of the Soviet Union is remembered by many who lived through it as a time of pervasive shortages. Photographs from the late 1970s and 1980s show long lines of people waiting outside shops in Moscow and other cities, hoping to buy sausages, butter, or other basic items. The state's inability to provide adequate consumer goods eroded public confidence and contributed to the sense that the system was failing. The trade relationships the Soviet Union maintained with the West during the Cold War reveal a fundamental tension at the heart of the Soviet project. On one hand, the USSR presented itself as a self-sufficient socialist superpower, ideologically opposed to capitalism and economically independent. On the other hand, the Soviet economy was deeply integrated into global markets, dependent on Western technology, machinery, and even food. This dependency was masked during periods when energy prices were high and export revenues flowed freely. But it became glaringly apparent during the 1980s when falling oil prices, combined with the costs of the war in Afghanistan and the arms race with the United States, pushed the Soviet economy toward crisis. The trade data from 1986, near the end of the Soviet era, provides a snapshot of an economy that had become structurally imbalanced. Fuel and electricity accounted for nearly half of all exports, a dangerous over-reliance on a single sector vulnerable to global price fluctuations. Imports of machinery and equipment, food and consumer goods consumed a large share of export revenues, leaving little room for investment in modernization or innovation. The Soviet Union had become, in effect, a resource extraction economy with a superpower military and a first-world space program, but a third-world consumer sector. The Iron Curtain had never fully sealed off the Soviet economy from the West. Instead, it had created a selective permeability, allowing certain kinds of trade to flourish while restricting others, permitting the flow of goods while attempting to control the flow of ideas and information. The legacy of this trade relationship extends far beyond the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The energy infrastructure built during the 1970s and 1980s, particularly the gas pipelines connecting Russia to Western Europe, remains in operation today. Russia continues to supply a significant portion of Europe's natural gas, and the geopolitical tensions that worried American officials in the 1970s have not disappeared. If anything, they have intensified, as recent conflicts over Ukraine and energy security have demonstrated. The dependency that was created during the Cold War, when Soviet planners and Western European governments struck their pragmatic bargains, has proven remarkably durable. It has survived the end of communism, the expansion of NATO, and multiple cycles of sanctions and diplomatic crises. The story of how the USSR traded with the West, despite the Iron Curtain, is ultimately a story about the limits of ideology and the persistence of economic logic. Political leaders on both sides of the divide spoke in the language of irreconcilable opposition, but they acted according to the calculus of national interest and economic necessity. The Soviet Union needed Western technology, machinery, and food. Western Europe needed affordable energy. Both sides found ways to accommodate these needs, even when their governments were locked in geopolitical competition and their militaries were preparing for potential conflict. The trade that flowed across the Iron Curtain did not prevent the Cold War, but it did create channels of communication and mutual dependence that may have helped prevent the cold conflict from turning hot.